If your engine suddenly starts cranking too long, misfiring, stalling, or refusing to start at all, one part you do not want to overlook is the ignition control module. This is one of those failures that can confuse a lot of people because the symptoms often look like a bad coil, a bad crank sensor, bad spark plugs, or even a fuel problem. But when the ignition control module starts going bad, it can interrupt spark control in a way that makes the engine run rough, lose power, or die without much warning. So in this video, I'm going to show you the most common signs and symptoms of a bad ignition control module, how it affects the engine, and the signs that can help you tell when this module may be the real problem. So, what is the function of the ignition control module? The ignition control module helps manage the spark system. Depending on the vehicle, it can control when the ignition coil fires, work together with sensors like the crankshaft position sensor, and send the proper signal needed to create a spark at the right time. On some older vehicles, the ignition control module plays a very direct role in controlling spark timing. On other vehicles, its function may be tied more closely to the engine computer. But either way, if the module fails, spark can become weak, erratic, mistimed, or disappear completely. That is why, when the ignition control module starts going bad, the engine can run poorly or stop running altogether. One of the biggest signs of a bad ignition control module is a crank no start condition. The engine turns over, but it will not fire up because the ignition system is not producing spark the way it should. If the ignition control module fails completely, it may stop triggering the coil, which means the engine cranks normally but never starts. This is one of the reasons a bad ignition control module can look like a fuel problem at first. The engine just keeps turning over, but it does not catch. Intermittent stalling is another major symptom. A failing ignition control module can also cause the engine to start and run normally for a while, then suddenly stall. This often happens because heat affects the module. As the module warms up, internal failure may get worse, and the spark signal can drop out. Then, after the car cools down, it may restart again and seem normal until the problem comes back. That hot then stall pattern is one of the classic warning signs people notice with a failing ignition control module. Misfires and rough running. Another very common symptom is engine misfire. If the ignition control module is sending an unstable signal, the spark may not happen consistently. That can cause one or more cylinders to misfire, especially under load, during acceleration, or even at idle. You may feel the engine shaking, stumbling, hesitating, or running unevenly. In some cases, the misfire may come and go. In other cases, it may become more constant as the module gets worse. Hard starting or long cranking. Sometimes the module has not failed completely, but it is getting weak. In that case, one of the first symptoms can be hard starting. The engine may crank longer than usual before it starts, especially when hot. That happens because spark control is becoming inconsistent, so the engine takes longer to fire up properly. Sudden engine shutoff while driving. A bad ignition control module can also cause the engine to shut off suddenly while driving. This is one of the more serious symptoms because it can happen with little warning. If the module loses the ability to control spark, the engine may cut out as though someone switched the key off. Sometimes the engine restarts right away. Sometimes it has to cool down first. Either way, sudden shutoff is a strong warning sign that should not be ignored. No spark condition. If you test the ignition system and find there is no spark, the ignition control module becomes a major suspect. Now, that does not automatically mean the module is bad, because other parts like the crankshaft position, sensor, ignition coil, wiring, or power supply can also cause a no spark condition. But the ignition control module belongs high on the suspect list when spark disappears and the rest of the system checks out. Loss of power and hesitation. When the ignition control module starts failing but has not completely died yet, the engine may still run, but performance can suffer. You may feel hesitation when accelerating, weak response under load, random bucking, or poor power. That happens because spark timing or spark delivery is no longer stable. A lot of people describe it as the engine feeling lazy, jerky, or inconsistent. Check engine light may or may not come on. In some vehicles, a failing ignition control module may trigger the check engine light. In others, it may not. That is why you should not rule it out just because there is no code. Some ignition control module failures show up more as real-world symptoms than clean diagnostic trouble codes. And even when codes do appear, they may point you toward misfires or ignition-related issues without naming the module directly. Another pattern to always pay attention to is heat-related failure. If the car starts fine cold, runs for a while, then begins misfiring, stalling, or refusing to restart until it cools down, the ignition control module becomes much more suspicious. That is because electronic modules can fail internally when heat builds up. Then once they cool off, they temporarily work again. This can make the problem seem random when it really is not. Now, here is what a bad ignition control module can be mistaken for. A bad ignition control module is often confused with a bad ignition coil, bad crankshaft position sensor, a bad camshaft position sensor, bad spark plugs, or even fuel delivery problems. Now, when you see a pattern of no start, hot stalling, misfires, no spark, and restart after cooldown behavior, the ignition control module deserves serious attention. So there you have it on the signs and symptoms of a bad ignition control module. And if this video helped, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel.